The East versus the West, Christianity versus Islam, cross against the crescent. This is usually how the Crusades are viewed, a series of holy wars waged by two sides for the control of the Holy Lands. However, this is a faulty view. In reality, the First Crusade involved almost a dozen parties with differing and even conflicting aims on both the Christian and the Islamic side. In this video, we will be taking a closer look into who fought in the First Crusade, why they fought, and what they wanted to get out of it. But before we start, please subscribe and leave a like. Enjoy! Before we get to the key players, I want to generally delve into the general feeling the average people had during the late 11th century regarding the Crusade. The average peasant, the merchant, and the lower aristocracy, if you will. I think it would be fair to generalize Europe and the Middle East into three spheres with differing general public interests. The first of these was the Latin, Catholic Europe. In the last few centuries, Western Europe had seen a population boom, with the European population almost doubling between 800 and 1100 AD. It was the medieval warm period, and the colder North and Western European realms had largely benefited from the increased agricultural output. Over the centuries, the Magyar, Viking, and Arab raids were also stopped, and Latin Europe had entered an era of expansion, politically, demographically, and economically. The ongoing Reconquista and the Norman conquest of Sicily had expanded the Latin periphery in the south. Meanwhile, in the east, Hungary and Poland had joined the papal fold. Combined with the conversion of Scandinavia to Catholicism, High Middle Ages would see the zenith of the Catholic power. In this environment of population boom and general prosperity, the people of Western Europe both needed further expansion and trusted their religious institutions. The people were ready to fight and die in the name of their God and required new lands. This combination would motivate tens of thousands to join the crusade for the Holy Land. The second periphery was the Eastern Christianity, dominated by the Orthodox Patriarch and the Emperor in Constantinople. In contrast to Western Europe, the Orthodox world had been shrinking for the last 500 years. 11th century was especially tough for the Eastern Romans, as they had lost the control of half of their lands. In general, the average Roman either lived under the occupation and constant harassment of the nomadic Turks, or lived in constant threat of massacre and occupation in the ever more insecure Byzantine territories. The average Eastern Christian cared little about the Holy Land or Jerusalem, and yearned for security and peace of the previous centuries. And the last periphery was the Islamic world. This periphery was characterized by the Turkic steppe nomads that roamed in the countryside with their flocks, and the settled city dwellers. These two groups lived very different lives and cared little for each other. The settled population, usually backed even by their Turkic rulers, wanted a peaceful environment to trade and farm. Meanwhile, the nomad wanted to freely roam the steppes, disregarding property and state boundaries while avoiding any taxes. He cared little about the Holy Lands, as there was little grass there for his horses or sheep. His grandfather or father was a pagan that believed in the sky god of the steppes, and he himself was maybe willing to kill for his new religion and the Holy Lands, but certainly was not willing to die for it. The last century was marked by the nomadic colonization of the Middle Eastern countryside, and the average Persian or Arab peasant benefited from this no more than the Eastern Roman farmer in Anatolia. This division between the widely different Turkic nomads and the settled locals prevented the formation of a unified counter-movement against the Crusades in the general Islamic world. But what about the great men of the era, the barons, the emperors, and the sultans? What did they want? The most influential figure of the First Crusade was definitely Pope Urban II. He was the mastermind behind the First Crusade. Now, before I go on to explain the worldly desires of both sides, I just want to remind everyone that the medieval world was dominated by religion, and people sincerely believed in their God. Martyrdom and service for God were huge motivators for everyone. Now, putting the very real and influential religious fervor aside, Pope Urban mainly wanted two things out of the crusade. The papacy was in the process of a centralization reform started by Urban's predecessor, Gregory VII. The Holy See wanted to centralize the clerical appointments all across Christendom and establish itself as an authority above the feudal, secular rulers of the land. This had put the papacy in a conflict against the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, who did not intend to share his power with the Pope. In fact, when Urban II became the Pope in 1088, the city of Rome was under German occupation, and Urban was in fact elected in another city in southern Italy. With the First Crusade, Urban hoped to gather an army directly under him and prove his legitimacy by leading it successfully against the infidels to liberate the Holy Lands. Such a success would not only prove Urban II's legitimacy, but also set a precedence for the Pope leading the secular barons and kings of Europe. Another ambition of the papacy was gaining supremacy over the Eastern Christians, marching east with a large army and saving the Eastern Christians from their 500-year-long oppression would firmly establish the Pope over the Patriarch in Constantinople and put an end to the schism that divided the Christian world. In general, Pope Urban II was trying to position himself as the leader of a unified Christian world with this crusade. The barons and the great lords that would follow Urban's call had different ideas, however. Some of them were almost certainly motivated by their faith, like Raymond of Toulouse, who abandoned his riches and lands and wanted to die in the Holy Lands. Meanwhile, some saw their prospects dwindling in Europe and were likely motivated by a mixture of their hardships and religious zeal, like Robert of Normandy, who was having a hard time against his brother in England, or Baldwin of Flanders, who was a younger son with no great prospects in his homeland, or Hugh de Vermandois, who was sent by his brother, the excommunicated King Philip I of France, as a peace offering to the Pope. Meanwhile, some almost certainly went to plunder the riches and the wealth of the Orient, like Bohemond of Taranto. Bohemond was disowned by his father, Robert Guiscard, and prevented from inheriting Robert's kingdom. He was left with a small fief in Sicily under his younger brother, Roger. Bohemond had seen the riches of the East firsthand when he and his father had invaded Byzantium back in 1081, and likely still had ambitions on the Byzantine lands. For him, the crusade was a way out of a hopeless civil strife against his brother in Sicily and a way to achieve his eastern ambitions. And likewise, Bohemond would die trying to organize another invasion of the Byzantine Empire. But across the Adriatic, in the grand city of Constantinople, what did Emperor Alexios I of the Byzantine Empire want out of this crusade? After all, alongside the Pope, he was the co-organizer of the crusade. Alexios was an emperor of an empire in serious decay. The Byzantine Empire had lost almost entire Anatolia, which made half of the empire. Alexios was able to stabilize the imperial control in Europe and restore its tax revenues. However, he lacked the military means to restore the borders in Anatolia. The indigenous Byzantine military was almost completely rooted out in 11th century by short-sighted emperors and military disasters like Manzikert. Alexios had relied on Turkish and Norman mercenaries to defeat the Pechenegs, and used Turkish mercenaries to defeat the Normans in 1080s. However, he could not hope to use Turks to fight Turks in the reconquest of Anatolia. He needed a decent number of heavy Frankish knights to give him a chance against the Turkic riders. A few thousand heavy knights to help him reclaim Anatolia, and safety from Catholic foes like Hungary and Normans in the meantime was all Alexios wanted. He did not care about the Holy Lands, and he certainly did not want the Latin influence to grow in his own backyard. For him, this was no holy war. It was the continuation of the 1,000-year-long chess game of Constantinople to secure itself and its periphery from the barbarians at the gates. And when he saw the Latin hordes at the gates of Constantinople, he likely did not see much difference between them and the Turks. Now, as we get into the leaders of the Islamic world, I think the readers usually do not fully understand the extent of disunity in the Islamic world. The Islamic world in the Near East was dominated by two powers, Seljuks from Anatolia to Afghanistan and Fatimids in Egypt. The Fatimids were in serious decay, and the Seljuks were in a free-for-all civil war between the members of the dynasty, who controlled parts of the empire. Let's go from north to south. The first foe the Crusaders would encounter was Sultan Kılıç Arslan I of Anatolia. However, he was more of an exiled prince of the Seljuk Empire than the Sultan of Anatolia. His grandfather Kutalmış was Sultan Tuğrul's cousin. Upon Tuğrul's death, Kutalmış fought Sultan Alparslan in a civil war for the Seljuk throne. Kutalmış lost the civil war and was killed by the victorious Alparslan. Meanwhile, his son Süleyman, Kılıç Arslan's father, was exiled to Byzantine Anatolia, where he founded the Sultanate of Rum after the Byzantine collapse in the Battle of Manzikert. Kılıç Arslan had a claim to the great Seljuk throne in Iran and ultimately wanted to use his power base in Anatolia to achieve this goal. As the First Crusade was picking up steam, Kılıç Arslan wanted to maintain peaceful relations with the Byzantines since he wanted to secure his western front while he campaigned in the east for the Seljuk throne. In fact, after his defeats and loss of territory to the Crusades, Kılıç Arslan would not even attempt to regain the lost territory in the west and instead fully commit to his eastern invasion. Though at the end, he would share the same end with his father Süleyman and die in his failed eastern invasion. To further south, the Seljuk Syria was in complete anarchy. The Seljuk Sultan in Syria, Tutush, was killed in Iran after his failed attempt to seize the great Seljuk throne. After his death, his lands in Syria were divided between his two sons, Rıdvan in Aleppo and Dukak in Damascus. The two brothers had two goals overall: to retain their independence and destroy one another. And the last part of this equation between the sons of Tutush was the ruler of Mosul, Kerbua. Kerbua wanted to expand his domain to Syria as he saw Rıdvan and Dukak as easy pickings. This three-way standoff between Rıdvan, Dukak, and Kerbua was the reason the Crusaders would face minimal resistance in Syria, for they knew victory of one of them would mean the end of the other two. They would rather have Crusaders take the Holy Land than see each other grow too powerful. To their south lay the last player in the region, Al-Afdal of the Fatimid Caliphate. Al-Afdal saw the Sunni and nomadic Seljuks as the greatest threat to his rule. As the Seljuks disintegrated, he saw an opportunity to re-establish Fatimid control in Syria and led several invasions. His forces would even manage to capture Jerusalem from the Turks in 1098. El-Afdal saw the Crusaders as Byzantine mercenaries and viewed them as natural allies against the Turks. He wrongly assumed that the Crusaders would continue advancing against the Turks while ignoring his domains in southern Levant. He failed to realize the fanatic goals of the crusade, and this would cost him dearly. El-Afdal ignored the Crusader advances, and the Fatimid armies would get caught completely unprepared. So this was the general situation in the Old World just before the First Crusade. A growing Western Europe hungry for further expansion, the Orthodox world in decline, and the Islamic world divided. If you liked this video, please subscribe and leave a like, and I will catch you in the next one.